Before we get to the new content, if Jim, you could advance the slide, please. This is the agenda for our meeting. I'm not going to talk us through this, but these are the topics that we'll be talking about today. But I would like to just take a step back for a moment. So we'll go to the next slide, Jim, and talk about a little bit of history here. Today we'll be looking at BOK 3.0, which means that there was a 1.0 and a 2.0. 1.0 was essentially a set of competency statements that are still at the base of the program. BOK 2.0, next slide, please, was really based on this notion of lead, think, plan, act, and it has served us very well for these past 9 or 10 years. Over time, there were comments that, well, lead and thinking occurs throughout the model, and then there was a study done on the job task analysis to look at exactly what strategy professionals do, and that took us to 3.0. Now, in our work here at LBL Strategies in preparing people for certification, the next slide, Jim, this is the way that we have looked at it historically in terms of these 6 phases and tasks that are involved, which are all aligned with BOK 2.0 and has served us well. Along the way, I made the commitment to all of our learners, adult learners, that when the time came, that we would make sure that we share what's happening with the BOK in 3.0 and that we would be adjusting our course content to align. And I'll say something more about that in a few minutes. But for now, let me introduce you to Dean Black. Dean is the certification director for IASP. He's been a great addition to the team, and I know you'll enjoy hearing what Dean has to say. So all yours, Dean.
Thank you so much, Randall. As usual, very, very kind words. Hello, everybody. It's great to have you all here. I am especially noting the presence of some folks who have been emailing me over the last few days about important topics like study groups and certification and resources. So hello, and thank you for joining us today. I have been encouraged to talk to the 2 levels of certification ever so briefly. These non-proprietary certifications that the International Association for Strategy Professional offers the world. We're very, very proud of these certifications and all the work that underscores the whole process behind them, especially the work of Pierre Hadea and James Stockmall, our principal authors who have shaped the development of 3.0, which continues to evolve, especially with regards to the leveraging and application of tools that help the strategy processes. Our certifications are of interest to 2 probably distinct groups. The strategy planning professional, or level 1 as we refer to them, is designed for strategy professionals and practitioners who work with executives, directors, managers, all throughout any and all organizations, and the teams, all in an effort to formulate strategy. Also, these candidates contribute to some of the domains in the strategy lifecycle, and many of you will probably be familiar with the domains that underscore the work of Pierre and James and all who have contributed to the development of 3.0. And I'm specifically talking about strategy engagement, strategy formulation, preparing for strategy transformation, and of course, the last one, strategy execution, governance, and evaluation. So for anyone interested in the strategy planning professional certification, the application asks of you a little bit about your experience, and you can see the breakdown on this very, very informative slide, more like a set of notes that you can take away to help you understand this part of the briefing. Your experiences are important because the more experience you have, the more likely you are going to succeed at the certification. And the more education in the strategy field, of course, will also be important. And it's this combination of education and experience that will stand you in a good stead for the evaluation process to determine at what level it's most appropriate for you to come into the strategy, certified strategy professional world with us. In terms of the strategy management professional, or the level 2, you can easily see the experience criteria are considerably different in many respects. But probably the easiest way to think about it is, while the SPP folks are the ones who work throughout the organization at the level of management, working with all of the folks who can contribute to strategy, it's the SMPs that work almost exclusively with the C-suite level. In fact, they may be the chief executive officer, the chief financial officer, the chief operating officer, and so on. The C-suite is a team unto itself, and it requires specific facilitation and support. And it's the SMP folks that jump into that role and are the ones deemed eligible for this level of the certification. So those are the 2 certifications in a nutshell. I'll just try and conclude with some remarks about the exam itself. It's 3 hours long. There's 160 multiple choice questions on each. I believe the candidates are completing the exam on average around 1 hour and 50 minutes to 2 hours. So it's definitely within the realm of the possible to have plenty of review time to look over those items that may have been particularly challenging or new to your experiences. These items are developed by your colleagues and peers who have qualified before you. We have 393 SPP items, which will soon expand to 510 based on the submissions that we've received from SPP certificates over the last 3 weeks. We've had a really busy, excited, motivated team developing items that are aligned with the BOK 3.0 and the 2.0. There are close to 400 items in the SMP exam, and it is reasonable and fair for me to say that while they are indeed multiple choice, the SMP ones try to convey scenarios and case studies, ever so brief, just to make sure that you can see or be evaluated in terms of the context of strategy development across the domains that are there. I think that speaks to the main issues on this particular slide. I'll be here for questions. I see Joyce is raising her hand.
I'll just, if you want to address that one, Dean, before we get started, she wrote, thanks for the information about SPP and SMP. And what is the average pass rate for each credential?
Okay. The pass rate for each credential is 112 out of 160. And if you're looking for the average score across all of the people who try to write the exam, I don't have that information with me. If you're looking for the number of candidates who write, I believe it varies between 60% and 84%, depending on the level of certification. 60 to 67% for the SMP, and 63 to 84% for the SPP. I hope that helps.
Okay, great. I know that questions are going to keep piling in, but we're going to save them for the end. Dean will be with us at the conclusion of the formal presentation, and then we're going to get into the questions then because we have a dense pack of information from your lead authors. So I'm going to hand it over to you, gentlemen.
Hello, everybody. I'm Pierre Adaya. Nice to see everybody. So to begin, one thing that is very important that we wanted to mention were the contributors, because as you guys know, preparing an initiative like the BOK is very long, very complicated. And unfortunately, we cannot mention everybody, but I just wanted to give a shout to some of the people or most of the people that have contributed. Number one, of course, people who have worked on previous versions of the BOK, right? We could not have went as far without their help. There's, of course, a lot of people who revised the document, the many, many revisions of the document. There's also a lot of volunteers that have actually written some stuff that we are using directly or indirectly in the BOK. There's, of course, our copy editor, which is Tamara Highsmith, with whom I think it would have been impossible to do what we have done. And of course, board members and other members of IASP that have provided insights, hints, things to read, and so forth, that have allowed us to create the BOK that we think is gonna help us move the discipline forward in the coming years. So if we go, so the objective of the BOK, if we go to the next slide. Okay, everybody knows about strategy. I think you guys are here because you're familiar with the field. You know that the field is, I would say, 70 to 80 years old. You know that the field is well developed. We have a lot of ideas. We have great products. We have a lot of tools that are available. We know that the strategy field has passed the test of time. And of course, what many people know also is it is the dominant framework that companies use to differentiate themselves, because there's a lot of models in the field, there's a lot of disciplines, but I would say that strategy is the dominant one to help organization differentiate themselves and decide where they are going to invest their money so they can move forward. Yet, despite all the good things that the field has, we have identified two that we could say important issues. The first is the field is so broad that there's a lot of concept, a lot of activities, a lot of tools. And if you look at the definitions, they sometimes contradict each other. So that creates a problem, considering that for a strategy to work, we need the cooperation of people from different disciplines. So that's one of the issues. The second issue is strategy. I always call it the umbrella discipline, because it kind of protects or guides the whole activities of the firm, but it is related to many other disciplines: change management, architecture, project management, and so forth. But very often, there's kind of a glitch between the strategy and adjacent disciplines. So considering these two issues, we wanted to address them in our BOK. So that is why we tried to propose a holistic approach to strategy management, which explored the complete life cycle of strategy. Okay, you will see the 5 group of activities that we propose. They're based on research, and they ensure that we will encompass everything that is required to provide benefits from our strategy initiatives. So that was the objective of our BOK. And of course, when we started to design the BOK, we spent, I would say, a couple of months on design principles. I think design principles are really important because they give sight to how we are going to have our BOK evolve through the coming years. So if we go to the next slide, you will see that we have 6 design principles, okay? The first is the BOK is addressed to all strategy stakeholders. Okay, of course, there's the strategist, and the strategist is the key player from our discipline to be involved in such initiatives, but it is not solely addressed to the strategist. Any stakeholder who's going to be involved from close or far into a strategy initiative can find some solution within this BOK. What does that mean? That means that the BOK, the scope of the BOK is broader than the IASP certifications. And it was intended to be that because we believe that by having as many stakeholders involved, reading our BOK and learning from our BOK, I think it's going to improve the success rate of strategy initiatives. So that was principle one. Principle two, of course, the BOK is addressed for all sectors. When we mean all sectors, we mean private, public, nonprofit. Okay, and that is why when you will read the BOK, you will see that we favor the word organization compared to enterprise or company or so forth, because we wanted to encompass all the sectors. Strategy, I would say, being an old and well thought discipline, has a lot of theory. But despite the fact that we design our BOK based on strategy, it is definitely intended to practitioners. So the objective is to provide theory-based concepts that are going to allow practitioners to move forward in their work. If we go to principle number 4, as I mentioned before, terminology is key. When you go through the BOK, I don't know how many definitions there are probably at least 100. So we were very careful to define each of the words, and when need be, explain the difference between one word and the other, to be sure that when we communicate during a strategy endeavor, that we are all talking about the same thing when we discuss a concept, a tool, or an activity. Number 5, we build it to scale. Okay, one of the things I've noticed very often when I read documentation or when I see software development and so forth is things are often done for the short term. So we spend, I would say, almost a year deciding the structure of the BOK. Okay, and we'll talk about the strategy activities in a few minutes. And these are key because the way we structure the BOK is going to allow us, we think, to have it evolved easily for the next 10, 15 years. So we'll be able to add tools, concepts, and activities, if need be, from various disciplines, strategy and adjacent, so that it will enable organizations to reach their benefits. And of course, considering all that, the BOK is comprehensive. Okay, you will see we went into the concepts, we went into the activities. We will have in the version that we'll have, I would say early next year, more than 100 tools. Yet, many more tools could be added, many more concepts could be added, and so forth. So it is not complete. Okay, it is as complete as we could within the time frame that we had and the support that we had from the community to design the BOK. But of course, we hope that it will continue to grow in the future. So those were the principles. So if we go to the next section, we can go to the next slide. There are 2 key definitions we want to talk today. Okay, so the first, of course, is strategy. Okay, when I started in the field, I would say 10, 15 years ago, one of the most difficult thing was to find a definition of strategy, because I would say there's almost as many definitions of strategy as there are people working in the field of strategy. So how could we manage that? So looking through the literature, we understood 3 things. There are 3 commonalities that most of the definitions have. The first is strategy is about bringing value, okay, or gaining an advantage. Some people will say, well, you don't need to gain an advantage, but you always need to bring value. So strategy has to bring value to the organization and the stakeholders who are involved in the organization. The second thing, which is often cited by Porter, strategy is about making decisions. Okay, it's about trade-offs. I just watched a podcast from Michael Boboussin in finance. Every field that cites strategy, they always say it's about compromise, making decisions. And of course, last but not the least, strategy is about making choices of where you're going to put the resources. When we mean about resources, we talk about whether it's a technology asset, human resources, the money. Where are we going to put the money and the people for the company to move forward? So considering these three commonalities, you can see at the bottom of a slide the definition of strategy that we adopt in the BOK. So what do we mean by strategy? We mean the high-level guidelines that an organization adopts to provide values to its stakeholders. And Jim will talk about the stakeholders later. There's more than the customers, there's the owners, the partners, the employees, and how it allows the organization to gain an advantage towards competitors. Some people say, well, it's prescriptive, meaning you decide a strategy and then you implement it. And some people like Mintzberg are going to say, no, strategy is not deliberate, it emerges over time. Whichever vision you have of the word, both are applied within our definition. Okay, so that's very important because for us, there are high-level guidelines. They are not direct, specific rules, very detailed rules. There are other things, but strategy is basically the guidelines that are guide where the ship is going for the next few years. Considering that, if we go to the next slide, what is strategy management? Okay, so strategy management is very easy. It's the continuous cycle of all the strategy-related activities. Whether these activities are led by strategists or not, okay? Of course, we will focus on strategy, on activities that are led or guided by strategists, but there are other activities. But without all of these activities, and I will show you in the next slide, there are 5 groups of activities, you will not be able to have success in the long term. So the famous activities, if we go to the next slide, Jim. So in this slide, you can see 5 groups of activities, okay? So to be successful, an organization in whatever sector has to realize 5 groups of activities. And I call them group of activities because yes, they can be done together, but the specific scope of each activity is different, okay? So to begin, of course, there's the formulate strategy. So if you click enter, Jim. So formulate strategy, this is the activity that most of the people in strategy are very comfortable with and very familiar with. It entails looking at the environment, whether it's inside or outside your organization, specifying a strategic direction, where it's the mission, the vision, the values, and so forth, proposing strategy or alternatives, and then deciding the guidelines that are going to guide the organization for the coming years. This is formulate strategy, which is typically where the strategist is very often involved, and I would say the lead. But then what happens after formulate? Well, then usually once you formulate a strategy, you can click enter, Jim, please. Well, then let's say you decide, let's say you're a shipping company and you provide shipping services in North America. And in your strategy, you say, well, no, I want to expand my geography and I want to go to Europe. Well, once you decide about going to Europe, you cannot directly go to Europe. You have to do some actual transformation. And this is what we call transform organization. So transform organization is about planning how the firm needs to transform itself, how you're going to plan that over time, and how you're going to execute the projects to be able to execute your strategy in full. And once you transform, if you click enter, Jim, then you can actually execute the strategy that you previously formulated. Okay, and it's very important because formulate, transform, and execute, yes, they look at as they're linear, but they're all done at the same time. Because while I'm formulating something, Jim is probably implementing something, and Joyce is probably executing something else or part of the strategy. Okay, so this is very important. So, and what I've realized working with companies the last 15 years is formulate, transform, and execute is not enough. Okay, there are 2 other activities that are key. If you press enter, Jim, please. Well, the next one is, of course, what we call engage. Okay, engage means how do we motivate people to get involved in all the strategy activities? How do we motivate them? How to create a sense of urgency in formulation? How do we motivate them to install the new ERP system? How we motivate them to increase sales and so forth, okay? And engage is not only about training, it's also about diminishing the barriers. So how am I going to help all the stakeholders involved in the strategy to do their work better, faster, and in a more enjoyable environment? And last but not the least is govern, okay? So govern, when people tell me, Pierre, what do you mean by govern? I always mean oversee, okay? So oversee means direct, monitor, and adjust, okay? Because of course, when you're gonna formulate a strategy, let's say we decide to go to Europe, our shipping company wants to go to Europe, and then COVID comes along and we realize that shipping to Europe is not a good idea. So what are we gonna do? Are we gonna wait 4 years for the next strategic plan initiative to change our strategy? Well, in reality, no, you should have some committees and you have some governance activities that should be able to oversee what is going on and say, well, maybe this is not the time to go to Europe. Maybe we should stop for now, wait until we see where the economy goes, and then we adjust. So these are the 5 group of activities, okay? And these for us are key. And if you press enter, please, Jim, one last time. And as I mentioned before, they are all done at the same time, okay? And one person can be involved in the 5, but they're not the same thing. So when I discuss with somebody and I'm in the implementation, I'm transforming, but I'm working with Randall, I'm saying, Randall, how are we gonna make this easier for people? So I'm talking about engage, but even though I'm talking about engage, during implementation, the group of activities that we're doing are not the same. And you will see in the tools, in the activities, and in the concepts, they will vary from one activity to the other. So if we go to the next slide, Jim, please. Throughout the BOK, you will see the word operating model, okay, which is a key concept because a strategy is the guideline, the operating model is how the organization functions to be able to abide by the guidelines, okay? So these 2 things are indissociable, okay? So if you do enter, Jim, please. So if a company wants to be successful, okay, its operating model has to be aligned to the strategy, okay? And think about all the companies that you know, and you will see that this is very, very difficult, okay? Because guidelines are at a high level and the operating model is more detailed. So how can you make sure that your detail of how you function is aligned to your strategy? So this is a prerequisite. So what happens, enter, if you could do enter, Jim. Well, when you formulate, what you have to realize is that you are going to create a misalignment between the strategy and the operating model. It's automatic. As soon as you decide that you want to go to Europe and you've never been to Europe, automatically you will need new system, new people, new processes, and so forth. So automatically there's going to be a disconnect between the strategy and what the operating model provides the organization. So if we do enter one last time, transform organization, or what I call strategy implementation, is realigning the operating model to the new strategy. So this is how we really differentiate the word transform organization from execution. Because once you're aligned, then you can properly execute your strategy. If you go, so then we're done with that. So if we move to the next slide, Jim, then I just want to talk a little, one more time, please. I want to talk about the structure before I give Jim all the place to talk about formulation. So as I mentioned, the BOK is based on the strategy activities. That was very, very important, okay? So there's one chapter for each strategy activities. Each block or chapter is divided concept, activities, and tools. And why did we do that? Again, for scalability. So in the future, if somebody has a new tool that's interesting, we can add it. If there's a new concept that George brings, we can add it. If there's an activity that we forgot or we should add, we can add it, okay? We also use a lot of sidebars, okay? Every time there's a sidebar, it's either to explain the difference between a concept or it's to provide more detail, whether it's the public or a nonprofit company. Okay, because the 5 group or activities are tightly related to each other, you will see concepts that can be in many sections. For example, if you talk about DEI, okay, diversity, equity, inclusion, people say, well, sometimes it's engaged, sometimes it's in formulation. In the BOK, we decided to put it in one of the 5 group of activities, even though they are tied to the 5 groups or they are related in some sort of fashion to all the groups. We try to put it in the group of activity where we think it fits most. And if you do enter one last time, Jim, and one little word about references. Okay, if you notice in the first version of the BOK, we had a lot of references that we were repeating because we were trying to be as faithful to the authors. It's for practitioners. Yes, we want to be able to refer to the BOK, but it's not necessarily important to know exactly what Jim said or what Pierre said. It's important that we have the key tools, that we have the key references, and that we have the key references per section. So you will see in each section of the BOK, we put key references. And if by any way or fashion, you see some key tools or references that we forgot, please tell us and we will add them to the BOK. So all that was made in order to provide scalability for our BOK for the coming years. Thank you. Up to you, Jim.
Thank you, Pierre. So we're going to cover one set of integrated activities, formulate today. Next week, we'll cover transform and execute. And then on the third of the series, we'll follow up with engage and govern. So more new stuff to be told in the next couple of weeks. So I'm just going to go over the concepts and the activities in the formulate strategy set of activities. This graphic is a little hard, but it's kind of a linchpin for us in terms of you got your strategic direction, your mission, vision, and values. You've got a set of stakeholder value propositions, as Pierre had mentioned. Not only do you have to have a value proposition for your customers, but in the cases of many of the people who are members of IASP, they are owners of their organizations. And so there's a value proposition for owners. There's also a value proposition for your partners, who you work with, your supply chain, etc. And most importantly, there should be a value proposition for your employees. And we talk about that in detail in the BOK 3.0. That strategic direction will drive the definition of, as you go through formulation, to have one or more strategic goals, as well as key drivers of success to achieve those strategic goals. For each strategic goal, you may have a set of strategic objectives. And then for each of those strategic objectives, you may have one or more performance measures for that, as well as strategic initiatives to deliver on that continuous strategic objective that you're trying to achieve. So in the key concept section, we've got like 12 here that we talk about on the left-hand side of this slide. I'll just go over quickly some of those key concepts because I want to make a couple of distinctions building on what Pierre said. So many people these days are using both mission and purpose. And there's a number of new references that are in the BOK 3.0 that talk about a purpose-driven organization. And that doesn't mean that you're just a government entity or an NGO who has a mission, a specific mission to do X, Y, or Z. But there's a lot of research that shows that those organizations that are purposeful and that they can drive real good performance compared to other competing organizations. So we make a distinction between, yes, the classic mission, but we also try to identify why some organizations will have a purpose. I was working with a nonprofit organization about 4 years ago prior to the pandemic, and they didn't have a mission statement, they had a purpose statement. And working with a strategic planning team, we made sure that we can convey why this organization exists in a very changing, dynamic industry that they're in, as well as a purpose that should have these statements. It should inspire innovation, should have a sense of fulfillment and meaning, should create value in the eyes of the customer, and some people go as far as making a positive impact on their community. That was originally when we were redoing IASP's strategy in 2015. We wanted to make sure that strategy, the field of strategy, had an impact, a positive impact on the communities in which organizations functioned and operated. Vision, and one of the things that we talk about in 2.0 and differentiate a little bit more in 3.0 is that there could be a range of whether something is very concrete or it's very vague and more nebulous long-term. And so some folks like to have a vision that has a specific kind of key goal or things you want to try to achieve. Others try to make it very inspirational, not only to the employees and all the other stakeholders, but also it gives a sense to the customers and your stakeholders what you're trying to do. And then we talk about values, and values are fundamental beliefs, philosophies, or principles that kind of describe and guide the organization's character. Ed Schein did a lot of work on values, and there's different levels of values within an organization. You can have sub values based on the teams. It's all part of the culture that you're trying to create based on the direction of the company wants to do. We also find, and we put this in 3.0, is that values can play an important role in determining the direction that you go or act as a filter for those alternatives that you may have. Like Pierre said, if your overall goal was to expand your market and one alternative was to go to Europe, and then all of a sudden you can't go to Europe because of COVID, you had to be able to pivot. Well, how does the values shape what strategic alternative that you choose? So it works in many different ways in the organization. And then here's a little bit deeper dive on the different value propositions we've included in 3.0. Good example, I was teaching a strategy course a couple weeks ago to a governmental organization, and I mentioned Wegmans as a grocery store that just moved into the Washington, D.C. market from upstate New York. And one of the participants in this training mentioned how Wegmans has a really good employee value proposition, and it's a really good culture for the employees to work. Not only is it a good shopping experience from a customer's perspective, but also they put a lot of emphasis on making sure there's a clear value proposition for attracting and retaining employees to deliver value to the customers, to deliver value to the owners and the partners that they work with. We also went into, and this is important when we get to execution, because during execution, as Pierre mentioned, you're executing, you're doing all the different things. And so, if we look at a value chain and how there's primary activities, and Porter kind of defined the primary activities as inbound stuff, you get supplies in, you're operating, you're doing something with those things that you brought into your organization, and you're shipping it and delivering them to customers or other partners. You've got to market and sell those things once you've made them or in the process of doing that. And then service of those products or services. My example is Ford Motor Company. I worked with them back in the mid-90s so they could catch up with their Japanese competitors. And we had a 25-foot long chart of all of those primary activities. But we also knew that they couldn't do inbound logistics without procurement. They couldn't do operations without technology that they used, whether it's the shop floor or true IT. They couldn't do it without human resources in terms of hiring the people with the right competencies and skills that are needed to execute those primary activities. And then, of course, you've got overall firm infrastructure that could include, legal kinds of things, especially if you're going into a new market. As Pierre said, trying to go to Europe, you have to set up legal agreements with those operating countries or the countries you want to operate in. And so you have those support activities, and you need to look at all of those. And that's what we've expanded in 3.0 versus 2.0. And key drivers of success. We define that as in 2.0, areas, internal or external to the organization, where you have to be good at those in order to achieve your long-term vision and your strategic goals. Some people refer to key drivers of success as critical success factors. Another way of looking at it is the scaffolding for the building that you're trying to create. Some clients I've worked with in the last couple of years, technology seems to be an often real good key driver of success, especially if you're in a very competitive market. Innovation is often offered as a key driver of success, even in the nonprofit sector. I was working with an agricultural nonprofit recently, and they needed to have innovative services for their agricultural customers and members, but they also needed to be process efficient, and they also had to have really key partnerships. And this was an organization that has partnerships of about 12 other agricultural related associations. None can do it by themselves. They have to work with each other. And so here's a situation of understanding your competition is an important aspect in strategy formulation. No definitional change here in strategic goals. They're long range, generally stated directional aims. You can have a future state with the mission in mind. You could imply a completion date for some of those. Some people get very specific about that. Or you can have various milestones that you can trait those milestones into strategic objectives, which are outcomes or set of outcomes the organization needs to achieve in order to be successful at their overall strategy and meeting their strategic goals and fulfilling their vision. Then in measures, no difference here, but we also differentiate between strategic measures that could be quantifiable and qualitative versus a key performance indicator, which is a leading or a lagging indicator. Strategic measures are both leading and lagging. And then we talk about strategic initiatives. And that's the long-term things, might be several years that you're trying to do. As Pierre's example said, you may not be able to start doing shipping services to Europe, but that's something that you're going to work on as a strategic initiative. And then you have to make sure that you're aligning that new strategy with the operating model, which may be quite different based on that strategic direction to go into another market altogether. And then lastly, if you're very complete, the strategic plan could be visual as a one-pager, which I've worked with a number of organizations to do, but also from communicating to your other stakeholders. You might use more documentation of the mission, vision, values, strategic goals, et cetera, et cetera. I find the one-page visual to be very compelling. And there's an article that I wrote several years ago called Visual Information Maps that can help play a significant role in conveying your strategic plan. So what are those key activities, given that those are those key concepts? So we said there's 5. There's an external environmental scan. There's an internal one, and that we'll go into a little detail here. You establish the strategic direction, you choose the strategy based on that strategic direction, and then you complete the strategic plan. So for that environmental analysis, we think it's really important to gain a comprehensive understanding of the external forces and/or constraints. So these might be foresight activities that look at global trends or local market trends out and where you're operating. So in order to do an external environmental scan, you assess those macro environmental trends, and that's going to vary depending on who you are and where you are in your life cycle of an organization. For that nonprofit that I helped out this summer, we looked at big things. They're agricultural, so they have to deal with carbon sequestration. They have to deal with climate change, pollution, runoff, all kinds of different issues that they need to be aware of to know how they can help their agricultural members. It's also important to understand what the customer and other stakeholders wants and needs. And you can get very detailed on this, and we'll have some tools in the next iteration that talk about various tools and concepts to understand customer needs and wants. And then even when we're teaching this to people from the State Department, they understood why it was so important to understand their competition on a global scale. Who are those non-state actors that they needed to be aware of and formulating State Department strategy and policy. You also need to understand where your industry is and your specific markets or markets that you want to get into. Like Pierre's example, you want to get into Europe because you think it's going to be, you do, analysis and you think it's going to be really good for your organization. In the US, this past cycle of strategic plans, OMB, Office of Management and Budget, has said that they need to provide evidence that they did a strategic foresight exercise to understand possible plausible futures and how you're addressing it in your strategic plan. So they have to do that. And that's why the Federal Foresight Community of Interest is a growing and very important body to help agencies at the US level, as well as Canada, actually, because the Federal Foresight Community of Interest includes folks from Canada, which have been doing foresight for many years, as well as European and other entities around the globe. So to do that external, the internal environmental scan, we said there's 5 different things. Look at your core competencies, whether you're using a Gary Hamel or Prelahad approach of defining core competencies, or whether you're using a Jim Collins approach, talking about the hedgehog notion of what your core competencies, and both will serve you well to identify that. Assess the work environment, assess your core processes. That's where the value chain analysis comes in. And in some locations, or for some organizations, doing a location analysis and the resources, whether physical or plant or technology or human resources, those are all part of the mix that you should be focused on. And so we've expanded the notion in 3.0 to include specific activities to take a look at that. Why that was important, for example, when I was working for Walgreens, they did a thorough location analysis in order to know where they're going to put in their new drugstore. And then finally, you need to evaluate that current state of play. Establishing the strategic direction, you typically will have mission, vision, and values, or you can add purpose to that. You're going to have strategic goals, objectives, and initiatives, and overarching long-term goals. To establish the strategy, you want to confirm and affirm your competitive positioning. And in the nonprofit, they were faced with, how do we look at an acquisition, or do we think we might be acquired by one of the other players in the agricultural space? You want to make sure you're affirming your value propositions, identify key drivers of success, consider different strategies to get to where you want to get to, select those. And we talk about the filters you might use. Values are one way of doing that, but also making sure you're engaging with the leadership to understand where they would like to go and what they feel is to their best advantage. A few years back, we had someone from a agricultural organization give a keynote speech for IASP's annual conference, and they wanted to become more of a nutritional company. And one of their ways was they acquired a nutrition-related firm, and they realized while they were trying to execute on that strategy, they didn't have the competencies to actually manage and operate a nutrition-based firm. So they had to rethink what strategies they would have in order to move them into a nutrition space from the seeds business that they were in. And then lastly, you want to document the strategic direction and strategic components. So I was going to leave 10 minutes for Q&A, and I'm going to open it up to Richard to say what the key questions in the chat function were.
Thank you, Jim. Actually, we've been, between Dean and myself, we've been answering quite a few of the questions as we have progressed, but I do want to circle back to one from Joyce Reynolds and probably position this to you, Dean, Joyce qualified her early on question to understand percentage-wise as far as I guess first time out of the gate taking a certification exam, number passed versus number taking that specific test during that exam cycle.
Yes, and I'll be happy to look more into the statistics and get back to Joyce with the number.
Okay, super. Second question is a question about will these presentations that first of all, highly complimentary, great information, but I'm furiously taking notes. And I'm wondering if we will have access to a copy of the information on the slides for reference after the fact.
Yeah, and they also have a link to the recording, right, Richard?
Right, but in compliment, can we share the slides with people?
Absolutely.
Okay. Comment structure and explanations very clearly and simply presented. Thank you, Pierre and Jim. That's all the questions I have at this point in time.
And so are people going to be muted or can we open it up for live questions?
If the spirit moves you, want me to open it up, I will certainly do that. Let me get my participant control panel and
And Dean, maybe before we close the recording out, you might want to just talk a little bit about IASP, since some people on this call may not be familiar with us, who we are, and what tools are available for keeping them learning throughout their professional career. You've already talked about certification. But anything else you want to say regarding this slide?
And while Dean is thinking about that, everyone, you now have the ability to unmute and ask questions.
Yeah, I think this is the homepage here. We've been boasting of some tremendous success and transformation over the past year and a little bit, especially as regards the name of the organization. Getting warnings about my speaker setup here. I hope it's still working.
I can hear you fine.
Great. Yeah, the name of the organization has changed. Your speaker's not working. Please check your connection.
We can hear you.
Testing 1, 2, 3. That looks good too.
So if someone wants to sit for the exam, it looks like on this page, there's study materials available. There's also a knowledge center on the website. We have webinar Wednesdays, and we have a number of community of interests, like we have a government community of practice. We have a nonprofit community of practice. We have a young strategist community of practice. We have a women in strategy. And all those are ways to network and learn from each other, either as a member or as a lurking non-member. Is that correct, Dean?
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much, Jim. In addition to the changes to the website reflected in our name change and the like, there are some exciting new benefits offered to members in terms of establishing their portal and connecting to some of the groups that you've identified, the communities of practice and other individuals who themselves are your peers and colleagues who serve as resources that you can leverage for learning more and more about strategy as we go through. As for the certification aspect, there is a menu item there, which when drawn down can point to a number of resources and activities, including the schedule of cycles coming up with our next cycle 1 to 16 December. And for the first time, 4 cycles in 2023, 1 per quarter, with the first one coming at us in February.
Let me just add one thing, Dean, because I saw some questions. when you're a member of IASP, because some people are interested in the content from the BOK, you know, whether the visual maps or graphs. Once you're a member of IASP, you have access to the BOK. Okay, whether it's past version, the current version, we're going to release a new version, I would say, in about 2 weeks, which will have, I would say, have the tools. And then hopefully early next year, we'll have like more or less a complete version. So for all those who are interested, that will be available to you if you're a member of IASP.
Absolutely. Membership brings free stuff.
Yeah, and also the other resource that's here is Pierre is our editor of our strategy magazine, which comes out a couple times a year. And so if you're interested in writing an article piece, you can reach out to Pierre because he'll walk you through the process that we're doing. And this is in addition to our monthly Strategic Edge newsletter, which many on this call have written to. Joyce, I know you've raised your hand. What is your question, please?
Okay, thanks. I have two. First of all, I really want to compliment LBL and you, Jim, and all the people who put this together. This has been really needed, and I think it's wonderful. My question is why it was not listed. I tried to refer a couple of people to this when I was traveling, and it's not listed as an event on the ASP event page. And I would think that it would be good marketing, and I don't see any reason not to, list it there simultaneously and coordinate your registration, because people are going to look for it. I mean, when I told people to go, because I knew LBL was delivering it, but I kind of assumed. And then when I went to find it, it wasn't there. So I would just make a recommendation, you won't get the first one, but put the other ones on the calendar. It was in the newsletter, as Dean said, because I asked Dean about this and he didn't know why it wasn't. But I would really think that this is really important. It's a major step forward, and I don't see a reason not to. So anyway, that was my first kind of comment. Second thing, I really want to. This is to Pierre. I want to compliment you, Pierre, on the graphic. I have been bugging him for 2 years now about a graphic, and we had one kind of put together. And I really like having governance at the center. I would like to see some color coordination given our new color scheme. And on the graphic I used. So I took a snip of that graphic. Can I use that in our session tomorrow? Because when we're doing a session tomorrow I'm forgetting the title, but it's frameworks and principles and whatever toward promote conscious capitalism. And it's a guy from Penn State and he's covering all of those. So I have my old graphic in there. So
I'll send it to you, Joyce, of course. And I'm still working with the graphics. We're almost finished because we tried something that didn't work.
Okay.
But now I think we will soon to get it, and I'll forward it to you once we have. That's
great because it's better. It's better than the draft one that I had and I've been using for.
It's no problem. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
We have a couple of questions here, backing up to one about the compliment on structure and explanations being very clear and simply presented. A quick question: how does one translate this to specific department, for example, marketing or quality, etc.? I believe this is to you, Jim.
Yeah, so it's a good point. And originally 3 years ago, when we were working on, an outline of the content of execution, and we had all those other functions that you would see on that supply chain slide that I showed. So we talk about strategy for organizational as a whole, but we reference where it becomes important to talk about, say, a marketing strategy, and that could be a key initiative, right? Or it could be a certain transformation project that Pierre referred to. Operations are included in the execution section, especially focused on continuous improvement, whether you're following a DMAIC approach or you're following another kind of quality management kind of approach to continuously improve your processes in your organization. So we do cover that in the BOK in a light way, and that's where it's an example of how strategy intersects with the field of continuous improvement or Lean Six Sigma or other kind of quality management principles, because you can't do one without the other.
And Go ahead.
I'm just going to add to Jim. Yes, you can subdivide it, of course. He's absolutely right, but I would say be careful, okay? Because typically everything is intertwined. And when you're going to get, we'll talk about that next week. When you do the architecture and the transformation plan, you're going to do slices. You're going to take some slices. And of course, as Jim mentioned, it could be department. I will say yes, but be careful because you want to be sure that you have a coherent whole. Because don't forget, you have one and only one operating model, and it has to be aligned to the strategy. So yes, but be careful.
Good words.
Also, another question for you, based on your part of the presentation, Jim. Where can we find an example of the visual information map?
If they email me, I can dig up the copies I had. I was working with the Air Force, and there's a couple firms here that do graphic facilitation. And if it's really good, you can have a graphic facilitator document a strategic discussion using, whiteboards and stuff like that. And then people can translate that kind of graphic into a wireframe, if you're familiar with that term, and then ultimately turn it into a production document. So the Air Force was doing that several years ago, the Navy, a bunch of other organizations. So I could send you some links to visual information maps, or I can send you a link to my article that I wrote about it.
Jim, if you'd put in the chat area the email address you'd like people to reach out and request that. And while you're doing that, I've got a question for you, Dean. Can you please clarify what is the timeline for the exams to be updated to be based on 3.0? And I'm assuming 3.0, primarily.
As I understand it, there is no plan to make exams or the item database exclusive to context reflected in 3.0. The context that it can be found in 2.0 will continue to serve as a supplementary resource for study purposes. I think it would be also fair to say that the context that is reflected in 3.0 now and will be over time as the tools get added to the 3.0 is entirely consistent with items that are found in our item bank and on the exams. In other words, I don't think you can find anything in 3.0 that is not already addressed. In fact, the domains are already represented well in the item bank. And we can think of domains being pivotal to the structure of 3.0. If I had to put a timeline on going through each and every item, which were close to 1,000, I think I mentioned earlier, 6 months is a good target for that kind of review. But it's important to remember that 3.0 is the document that is guiding the International Association for Strategy Professionals, and the 2.0 remains a very important supplementary resource.
Great, thank you. In that light too, I had a offline question from somebody inquiring about our LBL Strategies Mastering Strategy program and how the relevance of our programming is going to stay in step and aligned with what's happening over on the IASP Body of Knowledge 3.0's introduction. And I can tell you that that we are maintaining our alignment with the developments coming out of IASP and adding them into our program content as we move forward. So we're very mindful to be that we have been respected as a preparatory step for people that want to re-immerse themselves in the theories and practices that are going to be highlighted in also accentuated in the IASP certification exams, that we're staying in step with those developments. I don't have any other questions here that have come in. If somebody wants to unmute and chime in, you have
I
access.
think Joyce, sorry,
No,
Richard, I
Joyce.
think Joyce has a question.
Yeah, Joyce again. Well, I put something in the chat. It's a session that US West Coast chapter is offering yesterday. The reason I put it in is that the speaker that we have is focused on international standards and frameworks. And I asked him, because I showed him our model, and he's covering all the bits, all 5 domains in what he does. And we just went through the run through this morning. But what I really think people who, if you're interested in measurement, he's a specialist and he's on all these international ISO boards. And I think one of our weaknesses in ASP has been on measurement. He's going to be focusing on DEI, on AI, and the impact of all these different things. But he has a section there on measurement. And I know that we added governance. I know Jim and I were working with Peter DiGiamarino, and governance was really important. I think, Pierre, you attended that session that Peter did a couple of years ago. And it was after that that we kind of started integrating some, or at least to me, I saw it integrating governance in. And I think that the measurement stuff is another area where we can get stronger and need to get stronger. And what I learned this morning with some of the stuff he talked about is the impact of AI on strategy. It's kind of like the 4th industrial revolution, or the 4th revolution is the way that he's positioning this. And there's some examples in there that were really quite powerful. So it'll be available if you can't attend tomorrow. It's 1 o'clock. I put it in there and I put the bit.ly for registering. But I was really impressed, and I'm promoting him to be a speaker for ASP, larger than just what US West Coast is doing. But I think it will be, I think his perspective he brings a really powerful perspective. So want to let folks know that.
Richard, if you let me share my screen just for a sec here, I'd like to address that question before last. This is what we're doing, folks, to keep up. You'll see that there's a new component relating to transform the organization. To me, that's the most significant change in BOK 3.0. This is something new and powerful, so we're adding that to the course. We're also beefing up the content that we have related to engaging stakeholders. And then lastly, and very consistent with the model that Pierre showed, governance is at the center. So we're doing our best to keep our coursework up to date. You can see when the courses are going to be offered in next quarter. And I just want to thank everybody for, showing up today.
Well, if there's no other comments or questions, Richard, I think we're 10 minutes over the hour, and everyone have a great rest of the day.
Yes, thank you all for joining us. As promised, we will send out a link to be able to download the recording of today's session, as will be the case with the next 2. And as Jim confirmed, we will provide a PDF of the slides so that you have them for reference on your desktop as well. So with that said, I'll stop recording.